For more on this story, we can bring in France 24's Catherine Norris Trent. Catherine, how significant is this announcement? Is it significant at all?
Well, like everything with Libyan politics, Delana, yes and no. I mean, it is significant because this really marks the beginning of a new stage. Peace talks are set to resume soon in Geneva under the auspices of the UN, and this is going to give them a new momentum. And the aim of these peace talks is to try and create some kind of nationwide political body. They want to pave the way to have nationwide Libyan elections within the next 18 months, write a whole new constitution. It's clearly very ambitious. But of course, Libya has been really divided between East and West since 2014. So the fact that Al-Sarraj has resigned as the Prime Minister of the GNA, the Government of National Accord, which was the UN-recognised authority in Tripoli, that does mean something, and that will kind of make it necessary for the various parties to sit down. We've also had the government in the East. Of course, the House of Representatives there, they've stepped down recently. So, there is movement here. It's not just stalling as we've seen in previous years. This is also significant in that it will probably no doubt intensify the infighting between the various camps in Western Libya. There are very powerful militias and armed groups and political groups, of course, in Tripoli, but in other cities too, notably in Misrata, a very powerful coastal city there, the mountainous city of Zintan as well. All these groups want their part of power. So now that Sarraj has stepped down, the question is who will replace him? We're going to see infighting, which could again descend into militia-based infighting and violence in the capital, Tripoli. It's significant as well because Fayez al-Sarraj, when he was Prime Minister, he signed a great number of deals with Turkey, notably on access to gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean, very controversial, Greece contesting that vehemently. Now the question is, what happens to those accords? Now the GNA have said they're not going to go back on any of their deals with Turkey, but Erdogan is going to be watching this very closely to see what does happen if a new political body is negotiated to govern Libya. In other ways, though, it's not a decisive moment because Fayez al-Sarraj was a very weak prime minister. He didn't have very much power. When we interviewed him last year, I mean, just outside his office building, we met people in the street who openly told us they thought he had no authority and no power. People on his own side were saying they didn't recognise his authority. And, of course, there is a big elephant in the room here, which is, the two governments, the political bodies have resigned. But what about Field Marshal General Khalifa Haftar?
He's still very much in place.
He hasn't reacted to this as yet publicly. He's still in place. Now, there has been a ceasefire and he's had to pull back from outside Tripoli, but he's not throwing in the towel as yet. So what difference will the resignation of Sarraj make, especially given that he said he intends to step down by the end of October, that it's his sincere desire to do so if another body is ready to take over in his place. And that is a big if.
That's a big if. Now, you know Libya well. You've been traveling to the country for years now. What's your perspective on the whole situation? Can there be long-lasting peace in Libya?
It is extremely complicated indeed to see that path to peace in Libya. I sincerely hope for Libyan people that can be found, but the divisions are so deep now. I mean, between East and West, this has descended into complete chaos. But Libyans you speak to across the board really do want to see a solution. There's a great deal of anger that the various armed groups and politicians and outside influences have not been able to get it together to get a stable government for this country. There have been demonstrations in recent days in Western Libya and in Eastern Libya as well in recent weeks. People really upset about living conditions getting worse, about huge electricity blackouts, which is astonishing really in such a big oil producer and company. There's a great deal of discontent. So there is a real desire for people to come together. I covered elections in Libya in 2012 and there was a real sense of optimism there following the ouster of Gaddafi and people saying, this is marking a new moment and a real desire to make this happen. So there is that. People are very bitter about the wars that have been breaking out, all the losses they've suffered. But perhaps if the politicians can get it together, that there is a will there to draw on. We've got to remember, though, that in Libya, it's not just Libyan politicians and Libyan people. This has become a huge regional and even global proxy war with
many
players.
cooks in the room.
There are many cooks in the room. So, different sides backing. We've got the Turks who are backing the GNA. We've got the Russians who are backing Haftar, the Emiratis, people say France as well supporting Haftar, Americans. To some extent, we don't really know what. This is a hugely complicated problem, and perhaps the solution to this is also going to have to be negotiated outside Libya. There are suggestions that the Turks and the Russians are holding talks between themselves to try and find some consensus and try and get this not to just be a ceasefire with Libya divided between east and west, that's where it's frozen now, this conflict, but to find a lasting political solution.
We'll see what happens. Catherine, thank you very much for that. Catherine Norris Trent there.